George discovers the shocking truth. His wife not only cheated on him, but she was also part of a clever manipulation that led to this situation. It turns out, she's not just a traitor, but the mastermind behind the game, and he was just a pawn in her plan. But here's the question. Can George escape this trap, or is he already too deep in her game? What will happen next? There's only one way to find out. I woke up in the middle of the night, not understanding what had woken me. The room was dark, with only a faint blue glow coming through the curtains from the window opposite. I turned over to the other side, reaching out to embrace Edith, but instead, I felt only the cold sheets. She wasn't there. My heart immediately clenched, though I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe she just went to the kitchen to get some water? I sat up a little and listened, but the apartment was silent. I slowly sat on the edge of the bed, trying to make sense of my feelings. My gaze landed on her phone, lying on the nightstand. It struck me as odd. Edith never left her phone unattended, not even when she went to the bathroom. I knew this because I had often caught myself thinking that she had become overly cautious with her device lately. It made me uneasy, but I tried not to overthink it. Now, with her leaving her phone and disappearing in the middle of the night, my suspicions were starting to take shape. The phone vibrated. The screen lit up, and I involuntarily glanced at it. A message from someone named Dale Wilson. My body tensed. I didn't know any Dale Wilson, but the name sounded familiar. A director. I had seen his name among her contacts when I accidentally glanced at her phone last week. She had said she was going to an audition, and he was supposedly considering her for a role. But why was he texting her in the middle of the night? I reached for the phone, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. My hand hovered over the device, my mind torn between wanting to read the message and fearing the truth. The phone vibrated again. Another message. When can you come again? I've missed you. I froze, feeling the blood drain from my face. Inside, everything went cold. This couldn't be true. I refused to believe it. My thoughts raced. Where was she now? If he missed her, it meant they had already met before. How long had this been going on? What else didn't I know? I stood up, keeping my eyes fixed on the phone. The idea of checking her messenger, looking at her chat history, flashed through my mind, but I stopped myself. If I did that, there would be no going back. I would know everything, all the filth, all the truth, which could break me. But was there any point in living in ignorance? I took a deep breath and picked up the phone. I was trembling as if I was about to do something terrible, but in reality, I just wanted to know. It was unlocked. She hadn't changed the password, which was already strange. I opened the recent messages and began to read. The first thing that caught my eye was that she wasn't just texting him. She was flirting. "You're so talented. I'm in awe of your work," she wrote. "If you could see what I'm wearing right now," another message sent 2 days ago. My temples began to throb. It got worse. "You're incredible. I'm already counting the days until our next meeting. I want you to take me again, like last time." I threw the phone down as if I had been burned. No, this couldn't be true. This couldn't be about my wife. The one I knew, the one I loved. But the messages were real. She was with him. They were together. And she didn't even try to hide it in her phone. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the darkness. Only one thought kept spinning in my head. What now? Spill everything right now? Cause a scene? Demand an explanation? Or pretend nothing happened and act smarter? Suddenly, I heard the key turn in the lock. I didn't move. I just listened. She quietly entered the apartment, trying not to make noise. She probably thought I was asleep. I heard her taking off her shoes, placing the keys on the table in the hallway. Then, silence. She was probably standing there, listening to see if I had woken up. I forced myself to breathe steadily. She carefully walked toward the bedroom, her silhouette appearing in the doorway. "Are you awake?" she asked, with a hint of tension in her voice. I forced myself to answer as calmly as possible. "I woke up by accident." She froze, as if considering something. "I didn't want to wake you." Her voice was soft, but now it seemed fake to me. She stepped closer, and I caught a foreign scent on her skin. It wasn't my perfume, not the one she usually wore at home. My fingers clenched into a fist. I couldn't hold back. "Where have you been?" She flinched slightly but quickly regained her composure. With the girls. We were just sitting talking, you know? I knew. I knew everything. But I just nodded. Got it. She lingered for a moment, as if waiting for me to ask another question, but I didn't. She sighed, relaxed, and went to the bathroom. I heard the sound of water running. I lay in the darkness, knowing I wouldn't be able to sleep anymore. Tomorrow, I'd find the evidence. The water had been running for about 10 minutes. I lay there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, forcing myself not to react, not to get up, not to storm in there and yell at her, demand the truth. My body felt frozen, but my mind was spinning out of control. She was lying. It was obvious. She lied so easily, like it was second nature to her. I was with the girls, she said, without even blinking. But I knew the truth. I had seen the messages. Read her words that weren't meant for me. What now? I couldn't just ask her. She'd find an excuse. Twist the situation. Make me look crazy, paranoid. I needed evidence. Not what I had already seen in her phone, but undeniable proof, the kind she couldn't dismiss. I heard the water stop running in the bathroom. A moment later, the lock clicked, and she came out into the room, wrapped in a towel, looking relaxed, like nothing had happened. Her skin was still damp, droplets trickling down her collarbone, and her hair was twisted up in the towel. She gave me a quick glance, like checking if I was asleep, and started drying herself off. I shut my eyes, pretending to sleep, but when she bent down to reach for her nightgown, I smelled it again. Not our shampoo, not her usual perfume. A foreign, masculine, rich scent that couldn't have just appeared. I wanted to ask her right then, where were you? Who were you with? But I held back. I waited. The next morning, I woke up first. Edith was still asleep, wrapped up in the blanket. She looked peaceful, carefree. If I didn't know the truth, I would have thought she was just a regular wife, tired from a long day. I got up, quietly went to the kitchen, and poured myself some coffee. I needed a plan. From my work, I knew that information was key. I couldn't act emotionally. If I made a mistake, she would know that I suspected something, and she'd be even more careful. I needed a detective. I opened my phone and searched, Private Detective Los Angeles. I picked the one with the best reviews and dialed the number. Weston Private Agency, how can I help? A male voice answered. I need help, I said quietly, glancing at the bedroom door. I'm listening. My wife. I think she's cheating on me. I need proof. There was silence on the other end. Then the man spoke in a professional tone. This is a standard case. We can set up surveillance, gather evidence. Do you need anything specific? Yes, I paused. Find out everything about Dale Wilson. Over the next few days, I acted like nothing had changed. Edith behaved the same as always. She was typing something on her phone, sometimes stepping out onto the balcony to talk, smiling at the screen when she thought I wasn't looking. I noticed everything. The detective worked quickly. Within a few days, he sent me the first results. Your wife frequently visits the Riverside Hotel. She spent a night there 3 days ago. Wilson is a director, but not very successful. He's had relationships with several actresses. There are photos. I'll send them to you in a secured file. I received the message but didn't open it right away. My hands were trembling. I knew what was inside. Photos. Evidence. But something inside me didn't want to see it. Didn't want to know the final truth. When I finally opened the file, it only took a few seconds to see what I already knew. Edith. Dale. Together at the hotel. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the screen as the world around me slowly lost its meaning. It's over. The game is over. Now I just had to figure out what to do next. I looked at the photos and felt something inside me break. It was strange. I had known the truth long before this moment. I had sensed her lies, noticed the change in her behavior, read those damn messages. But it was one thing to suspect, and another to see it with my own eyes. The photos were clear. Edith entering the Riverside Hotel. Edith and Dale together in the lobby, laughing, standing too close to each other. And here they were, leaving in the morning, relaxed, satisfied. She in the same jeans as the day before, with disheveled hair. I wanted to get angry, but the anger didn't come. Instead, there was something else, a strange cold calm. I didn't ask myself what to do anymore. I knew. That same evening, when Edith came home, I acted as if nothing had happened. She didn't suspect that I knew. She didn't even sense the change in me. Sitting at the kitchen table, she was texting, smiling at her screen. I walked closer, set a cup of tea in front of her, and pretended not to notice how quickly she flipped the phone screen down. "How was your day?" I asked neutrally. "Oh, like always. I was on set. I'm terribly tired." "Oh, really?" I pretended to be interested. "Where were you shooting?" She hesitated for a second, but then quickly smiled. "Oh, somewhere at a studio on Hollywood Boulevard. I don't even remember exactly." Lies. The lies were dripping from her words, but she didn't even try to come up with something elaborate. Because she wasn't scared. Because she was sure I knew nothing. I smiled. "Maybe we should go somewhere together, get some rest?" I said casually. "You've been so busy lately." She froze again. Her eyes darted around, looking for the right answer. Yeah, probably. But right now, I'm so busy. You understand?" I nodded. "Of course. I understand." The next day, I began to act. "I want you to help me," I said to Daisy when we were sitting at a cafe. She raised her eyebrows in curiosity. "Help with what?" Daisy was Edith's friend, but we always got along well. She was sharp, had her own opinions, and wasn't like those girls who just silently support their friends in any nonsense. "I know Edith is cheating on me," I said directly, "and I want her to pay for it." Daisy's eyes widened, but she didn't interrupt. "I want her to feel the same way I do." She stared at me for a long time, then slowly smiled. "That's interesting. What do you have in mind?" I leaned in closer and whispered my plan to her. The following week, I became even more observant. Daisy played her part flawlessly. She started visiting us more often, flirting, casually touching my hand, laughing at my jokes she hadn't even listened to before. Edith noticed this. Her gaze became tense when we all sat together. One time, Daisy left her lipstick in our bedroom. It was a little test, and it worked. "What's this?" Edith's voice was cold as she stood in the bedroom doorway, holding the red lipstick. I lifted my head from the pillow and forced myself not to smile. "What?" "It's not mine," she said, squeezing the tube in her hand. "Is this Daisy's?" I yawned and lazily stretched. "Well, if it's not yours." Her lips pressed together. "Do you want to say something?" "What am I supposed to say?" She threw the lipstick on the table and clenched her fists. "Are you with her?" I finally stood up, looked her straight in the eyes, and said, "What if I am?" She didn't know how to respond. "You." Her voice trembled. This isn't true." "Why?" "Because you're not like that." "And what are you like?" She went completely silent. I could see her face changing, how she understood, how all the pieces in her head started to fit together. "You know," she whispered. I nodded. "I know everything." She took a step back, as if I had hit her. "And now what? What would you like?" She didn't say anything. For the first time in her life, she had nothing to say. I stood up, walked over to her. "It was nice watching you get nervous." This was the plan. "Oh, yes." Her eyes glinted. "You're playing a dirty game." "I'm just responding in kind." She was silent. "Is this the end?" she finally asked. I smiled. "For us?" "Yes." She lowered her head, then raised her eyes and for the first time looked truly broken. "You don't love me anymore." "Did you love me?" A long silence hung between us. She didn't answer. Edith was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, not even noticing when I entered the room. She looked relaxed, smiling, as if everything was fine. As if the night before, she hadn't come home early in the morning, lied to my face, or had a fling with the director, the proof of which I was holding on my phone. I walked past her, opened the cupboard, grabbed a cup, and started the coffee machine. I felt her gaze on me, but she said nothing. It was almost funny. She really believed I didn't know anything. "How did you sleep?" she suddenly asked without looking up from the screen. "Great." I took a sip of coffee, calmly looking at her. "And you?" She paused for a second, then smiled. "Oh, I went to bed late." "Yeah, that's for sure." Her fingers tightened on the phone a little harder, and she threw a quick glance at me. "Are you angry about something?" "Why would I be angry?" "Just asking." I wanted to laugh. She felt the tension but didn't understand what was causing it. She thought her little secret was well hidden. The man, remaining calm, continued with his plan. But at some point, he began to feel that something wasn't right. It wasn't just revenge. It was something deeper. Watching Edith, he started noticing little details he hadn't seen before. Her gaze became colder, there were more hints of distance in her words, and in her behavior, changes that couldn't be ignored. The next week, he learned that Edith was involved in another matter he had previously overlooked. He accidentally found a record on her computer about some secret contract signed with a large company. It wasn't just a business agreement. It involved a large sum of money, but there was one condition. She had to betray him. Strangely, he wasn't even surprised. In fact, this document seemed very important for her career. But why hadn't she told him about it? He decided to dig deeper and started investigating. His suspicions were confirmed when he found a note in her calendar about a meeting with representatives of this company. And this is where it got really interesting. It turned out this wasn't just a conspiracy for career goals. It was a complex scheme, where not only Edith was the main player, but also he himself, without even knowing it. He started to realize that everything that had happened was part of a bigger game that had been played with him. His betrayal had been planned long before he learned about Edith's infidelity. All these manipulations, all the revenge he had planned, had become part of a script not written by him, but by others. It turns out that even Daisy, who had been helping him with his revenge, was part of this game. She was not just Edith's friend, but someone who worked for this same company, helping to confuse him even more. What's more, everything he had done was just part of a larger plan designed to control his life and business. But when he realized who was behind all of this, he decided it was his turn to play his own game. He slowly began to manipulate everyone, even those who had been with him. He started noticing other hidden signs, not only in his wife but also in those around her. And then, at the climax, when he had everything in his hands, ready to make his final move, another twist appeared. Edith herself confessed that she had known all along who was actually behind everything and why things had turned out the way they had. She told him the truth about her role in this whole scheme, but not as a victim, as an accomplice. Now, the last question remained. Did he want to be part of this conspiracy, or would he choose a different path and exit this game, cutting all ties with everyone, even those who were closest to him? George sat at the table, silently reflecting on the recent events. His fingers slowly circled a cup of cold coffee, and he felt his heart beat faster. Daisy was no longer just a friend, and Edith seemed to have completely lost the ability to hide her secrets. But the most important thing, he finally understood that everything that had been happening was part of some big game. He had become a pawn, without even realizing it. George glanced at the clock. In a few hours, he was supposed to meet with people from the company Edith had mentioned in her contract. His life seemed to have turned into something he couldn't control. And worse yet, he had a suspicion that this meeting might also be part of the same plan. He knew that turning back made no sense. Otherwise, his life would become yet another pathetic game in which he wouldn't even be a player, just a spectator. And that's when he decided. He would become the player himself. But before appearing at the meeting, George decided to talk to Edith one more time. He returned home, trying to remain calm. He entered the kitchen, where she was sitting at the table, once again immersed in her phone. "We need to talk," he said, sitting down across from her. Edith looked up, a mixture of surprise and discomfort on her face. She tried to act as if everything was fine, but George saw her hands trembling. "You know this has been a dirty game," he continued, "and I know more than you think." "I don't know what you're talking about." She put the phone on the table, avoiding his gaze. George smiled, trying to remain composed. "Don't pretend. I know about your contract, about this whole scheme. I've seen the documents." He pressed his hands against the table, leaning toward her. "You've been in the game from the beginning, Edith. But there's one question that bothers me. Why didn't you tell me the truth?" She stared at him for a few seconds, as if weighing whether to speak. Then her lips tightened into a thin line, and she muttered quietly, "You were part of the plan, George, and you didn't even realize it. Everything you did, all your decisions, were part of the game I couldn't avoid." George clenched his fists but remained calm. "You mean I was a pawn?" But who's the main player then? Edith fell silent, then seemed to gather the courage to say more. We're not the only ones, George. There are other people behind this. And you have no idea how much deeper it goes than just our relationship. You were just part of a bigger plan that I couldn't change. I couldn't choose. George smiled again, but now his smile was bitter. Oh, that explains why you've been so cold. You were just trapped in the situation, right? That's not it. Edith shook her head. I had a choice, but I couldn't tell you. There was no other way. I was used, just like you. These words left George with a dry mouth for a moment. She continued, this contract was just part of a bigger scheme, and I couldn't risk your life. I knew you wouldn't be able to handle it, no matter how hard I tried to protect you. I wanted to run away, but they kept me. George sat there, unable to believe what he was hearing. All his revenge, all his plans, turned out to be part of something much bigger and darker than he could have imagined. His heart raced, and he realized there was no turning back. He was now involved in this game, and he needed to figure out who was really behind it. I want to know more, George said, his voice controlled, but his eyes reflected determination. Edith nodded and began to speak. Remember how I told you about my partners? You need to know now that they weren't just businessmen. They want to control everything. My role was simple, to become your wife and drag you into this business. Now, they want to destroy you. George gritted his teeth. Who are these people? Edith sighed quietly. You won't believe it, but one of them is Miles. He's the one who helped you in the beginning. And Daisy is involved too. They used you to manipulate the situation. And now, it's all falling apart right before your eyes. Thoughts whirled in George's mind. Miles and Daisy? These were people he had considered friends. It turned out everything had been a lie, and he was just a pawn in someone else's game. He stood up and, without saying another word, left the house. He needed time to figure out what was going on. For now, he didn't have all the answers, but he now had a plan. He would find out who was behind this and discover why his life had become part of this deadly game. And when he did, there would be no mercy. George headed to Miles's office. He didn't have a concrete plan, but he felt it was his only chance to uncover the truth and unravel this web of lies. Miles had always been there for him, always supportive, but now George realized it had all been part of a bigger manipulation. He drove through the city, ignoring the familiar streets and buildings that had now become foreign to him. All these people he had considered friends had turned out to be enemies. And Edith, the woman he loved, seemed to be playing a game with him that he didn't even understand. She couldn't be trusted. Now, George wasn't sure why all this had happened, but he was determined to find out. Arriving at Miles's office, George could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He stepped inside and saw the familiar face that immediately smiled, as if everything was still in its place. Miles sat at his desk, going through papers. Hey, George, he looked up. What's going on? Something wrong? George couldn't hold it in anymore and, without waiting for more questions, asked sharply, What's your plan, Miles? Miles leaned back in his chair, not rushing to respond. His eyes gleamed, as if he already knew this question wasn't asked casually. He had a quiet confidence that suggested he was in control. What do you mean, George? He replied, his face unchanged. I know. George held his breath. I know everything. About the contract. About you and Daisy. About Edith. You're involved in this, right? You and everyone else have just been manipulating me. Miles tilted his head slightly, as if surprised. So what? He asked, acting as if nothing had changed. George was stunned by his calmness. Instead of being nervous, Miles seemed as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. George felt his patience on the edge. You don't know what you're talking about, Miles finally responded, his voice growing more serious. Everything you're going through is just part of a bigger game. George couldn't believe his ears. A game? Was his life just a part of some scam? What was going on? And why had all these people suddenly turned into enemies? I won't be your pawn, Miles. His voice became sharp and firm. You already were, George. And you still are, if you want to be. Miles leaned back again, as if lost in thought. I want you to tell me the truth. George stepped closer to the desk. Now. Miles stood up and walked to the window, his gaze contemplative. "Do you really want to know the truth?" he asked, turning back to George. "Everything you've done, everything you've been through, was part of a bigger plan. This isn't just about your betrayal. It's about getting access to something much bigger." George couldn't take it anymore and took a step forward, his heart racing faster. "I don't understand what you're trying to say." Miles looked at him, and there was a cold, barely noticeable expression in his eyes. "It was all for your connections. You're the key to a big deal. All your decisions, all your steps, they all led here. You were the one who could open the door to big money, to influential people, and you didn't even know it." George couldn't believe what he was hearing. All this time, he had been a part of a game, a part of a bigger scheme. But why? Why me? His voice became more nervous. Miles smiled, but it was an empty smile. "You were the perfect candidate, George. You thought you were nobody, but in reality, you were the best thing we could find. Your family, your connections, your opportunities, all of it we used to make this plan perfect." George felt a tightening sensation in his chest, a mix of betrayal and fear. He felt like everything was losing its meaning. Now, his life didn't matter. It was just part of a bigger game, one controlled by other people. "What should I do now?" he asked, trying to gather his thoughts. Miles looked at him, and there was no joy or sympathy on his face. It was just cold calculation. "You have to make a choice, George. You can continue playing this game, be a part of something bigger, or you can leave it all and run. But remember, you've already taken a step into this world, and going back won't be easy." George felt his heart stop again. Now that the truth had come out, he knew he couldn't be a pawn in someone else's game anymore. He had to become a player himself. He left Miles's office, but instead of heading home, he drove to the old factory they had once discussed. He knew there were answers to his questions there. And even if this would be his last meeting, he was determined to untangle the web of lies. As he approached the secretive location, his heart beat faster. This was his game, and he was going to win, even if it cost him everything. George drove through empty streets, trying to figure out what to do next. All he felt was anger and confusion. Miles, who had seemed like a friend, turned out to be part of a bigger manipulation. And now, his life had become a play on a big stage, where he was just a pawn, not a player. But he couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't let them win. George turned onto the old factory road, a place once used for dubious operations. The wind howled through cracks and broken windows, creating an eerie atmosphere. As always, it was empty and dark, with only a faint light filtering through the thick clouds. He stopped the car, got out, and headed inside. This was a place long forgotten, and his meetings with Miles here had always been somewhat illegal. But now, George felt there might be something important here that he still didn't understand. The fact that Miles hadn't told him the whole truth pushed George even more to find out. And the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. There was more to this than just manipulation. When he opened the door to one of the rooms in the factory, George saw someone he didn't expect, Eric. He was tall, with a soft expression on his face, and wearing a black suit that seemed surprisingly stylish for this place. George looked at him curiously, and Eric smiled as he stepped away from the wall, as if he had been waiting for him. "You?" George couldn't believe his eyes. He had only seen Eric once, a few months ago at an elite event, but never thought their paths would cross again. "Yes, it's me," Eric replied, smiling again. "It seems we weren't acquainted back then, but I'm interested in your decisions, George. What are you doing here?" George didn't hide his distrust anymore. He was surprised, but at the same time, he felt that the answers he was looking for might be here. "What's happening to you is just the beginning," Eric began, his voice calm, even slightly cold. "You want to know who's behind your fate? You want to understand what's really going on? You want to uncover the truth?" George didn't respond, but his gaze became more intense. Eric took a step forward, his voice quieter and more significant. "I know why you're here, and what you want to find out," Eric said. "But before you make any decisions, I have to warn you about one thing. Everything you see today will change your life forever. It won't be easy. You won't be able to go back after this." George grew even more wary, but despite his fear, he took a step forward. "What's this?" he asked, realizing that the whole truth was in this gloomy room. Eric looked at him with an unreadable expression and replied, "Today, you'll learn who you really are, George, and why you were chosen for this game. You and Miles aren't the first, and you won't be the last. This plan has existed for a long time, and you've been a part of it from the beginning. You're not just a victim. You are part of this machine." George felt his heart race. He couldn't understand why Eric was speaking to him as though he had already taken a step into an irreversible side. "What do you mean?" he asked, almost whispering now. Eric slowly approached one of the large tables, where documents and old maps were spread out. He picked one up and placed it in front of George. "This isn't just a financial deal. It's not just business. It's more than you can imagine," Eric said, showing him the map. "This is about power, about control. You are not a coincidence. You're part of what will become the biggest financial upheaval in the history of this city. Your role has already been determined." George couldn't believe what he was hearing. What seemed like an ordinary game was actually part of a plan that had begun long ago. What had he done? What was he supposed to do now? "You've chosen the right time to learn the truth," Eric added, guiding him to the end of this long path. "Now it all depends on what you do next. You can stay in this game, take control into your own hands, or you can leave it all behind and run. But remember, whatever choice you make will change your destiny. And your wife, Edith, she's part of this plan." George felt cold sweat running down his back. All his suspicions were now confirmed. This wasn't just betrayal. It was part of a grand scheme. "What do I have to do?" His voice had become firm, for he now understood that he faced a choice that would define his future. Eric looked him straight in the eye, a faint smile on his lips, and replied, "You choose, George, and I, as always, will be watching you." George stood before Eric, staring at the map and the documents on the table. 1,000 thoughts were tangled in his head. His entire life, everything he had considered real and important, was suddenly beginning to crumble. Everything he had heard now unfolded before him like a terrible nightmare, but it didn't seem so frightening anymore. It was real, and he was part of it. "You're probably wondering why you?" Eric asked, breaking the silence. George merely nodded. Everything was too complicated, and now he struggled to even ask a simple question. "Did you think your life was just a coincidence, that you were just one of many?" Eric continued. "But your role was decided long ago. You're not just a victim, as you thought. You're a player. And this game began long before you met Edith." "Edith?" George looked at the map, where places were marked that he couldn't understand. Everything was starting to get confusing. "What's she doing here?" Eric smiled again, but this time it wasn't a kind smile. He stood up and took one of the documents, handing it to George. "What you see here is only part of a bigger plan. Edith is not just your wife, not just your support. She's part of this game, too. I know you were shocked when you learned about her betrayal, but it was actually planned." George felt his heart freeze. He already knew her betrayal wasn't a coincidence, but now it all started to make sense. Why hadn't he noticed this earlier? She wasn't just an object in his life. She was part of the plan, part of this grand game. She, too, was a manipulator. "You're saying she's working for you?" he asked, not even knowing if he wanted to hear the answer. Eric looked at him with a cold expression. "She's working for us, George, and you will work for us too, if you want to stay in this game. You thought this was just a simple game of feelings, but in reality, it's a test. You've been part of the plan from the very beginning." George felt his head spin. He tried to gather his thoughts into one coherent line, but they kept falling apart. How could he turn back? How could he stop this? Now he understood that his life wasn't just a chessboard, but a global game where every step he took was part of a grand scheme. And even his mistakes weren't coincidences. What about Miles? How does he fit into this? George asked, trying to figure out where he stood in this game. Eric fell silent for a few seconds, glancing to the side. Then, as if contemplating, he replied, "Miles is just a piece on the board. He's part of the old team. But you, George, have become the new leader. You have a choice, and it's not an easy one." George raised his gaze and looked at Eric. He felt that they were on the threshold of something very big, and this choice would not only determine his fate but the fate of everyone around him. He didn't want to be part of this game, but his connections with Edith, with Miles, with this whole story, seemed so overwhelming that there was probably no other way. "What happens if I refuse?" he asked, not holding himself back. Eric looked at him again, his eyes becoming cold and merciless. "You can't refuse, George. You're already in the game. It started, and now you can't just walk away." Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway. George recognized her. It was Edith. Her expression was calm, but there was tension in her face. She looked at George and then at Eric. "Could you leave us alone?" she asked Eric, her voice soft but with some underlying threat. Eric nodded, smiling, and approached the door. "But before leaving," he said, "the decision is yours, George. Remember, there's only one way, and you've already chosen it." Eric disappeared behind the door, leaving George and Edith alone. An awkward silence hung in the air. George didn't know what to say first. Edith's betrayal, the manipulations he had just learned about, all of it had a huge impact on his mind. "Did you know?" he finally asked, his voice low and heavy. Edith stood still, looking at him. Her eyes were calm, but there was something in her gaze that irritated him. "Yes, I knew," she replied, her voice calm as if this was just an ordinary conversation. "But I had no choice. You know, George, how it works. You were part of this too. You're not alone." George felt his heart tighten. Everything he trusted, everything he loved, was part of this complicated mechanism, and even he himself couldn't choose where he fit in. George stood in front of Edith, not believing his own ears. She looked at him as though this was all just a regular part of her plan. Her calmness struck him even more. "You don't understand," she began, slightly tilting her head. "It's not just betrayal, George. It's not just a game. It's a way to survive. We're all just pieces in a game. You, me, and even Eric." "So, you knew from the very beginning?" His voice was tired and dull. Edith slowly nodded. "Of course. I was part of this plan before we even met. You were not just my husband. You were my support, my plan B, to strengthen my position. But it was all for something else. And now what?" George looked at her, trying to understand what was going on in her mind. "Did you think it would be that simple, that I'd forgive you? Or did you plan all of this until the end?" Edith didn't rush to answer. She stared at him, as if searching his eyes for something he himself didn't know. Her face was impassive, but there was something in her eyes that betrayed her tension. "I didn't expect it to turn out like this," her voice softened. "But it doesn't matter anymore. It's already decided." George felt his heart beat faster. Something was wrong. Those words, "it's already decided," pierced him as if he'd stepped into a trap. Suddenly, he understood. Edith wasn't just playing with him. She was playing with everyone. "Don't you regret it?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Edith smiled, her gaze turning colder. "Maybe I do regret it, but it's just part of the game. We all had our roles, George, and you didn't play yours." Suddenly, George understood. She wasn't just betraying him, she was manipulating him, pushing him toward a decision that would benefit her. And now, when everything became so clear, he realized that her betrayal was just part of the bigger trap they were both caught in. "Yes," he whispered. "Now I know it was just a game." Edith moved closer to him, her gaze never leaving his eyes. "But don't forget," she said, "you still haven't figured it out. It's not over. And what you think is betrayal, that's just part of the plan." "The plan?" George repeated. He was in shock, but starting to understand. "Eric," she said, "he was just an intermediary. They thought you were weak. They thought you didn't know anything. But you're part of something much bigger. You, George, are not just a player. You're a key player." At that moment, George understood. It was all a trap that he had created for himself. And even when he thought he was out of the game, he was just part of the grand plan that Edith and Eric had devised long before they met. "You can't escape, George," she said with a cold smile. "But we'll always be together. You and me. In the game, in life. This is our new beginning. You understand there's no choice, don't you?" George only realized this when she left the room, leaving him alone. All these months, all these years, everything had been set up as part of a plan. She was not just a traitor. She was the mastermind of this game. And only now did George realize that he, like everyone else, was just a pawn. and perhaps the last one who could break this damn chain, or sink into it once and for all. What do you think? Was it possible for George to break this cycle of manipulation and escape the game? Or was he already too deep into it?